So good afternoon. It's so nice to see you. My name is Elizabeth Lyon-Hall. I'm the Executive Director of COLLIS Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture here at Cornell University. My office is in Annabelle Taylor Hall, not Myron Taylor Hall. And for those who wonder if this is not a group of Latinists, COLLIS is Latin for hill, which, get it, we're on top of a hill here at Cornell. So COLLIS develops Catholic thought, culture, and community on Cornell campus and beyond through lectures like this one, non-credit courses, concerts, and cultural events. And I'm pleased to welcome you to the second of 3 talks in Words, Images, Reality, a symposium on living with AI, co-organized by COLLIS, the Society of Catholic Scientists, and the Thomistic Institute. It seems that no other topic today generates as much general interest, excitement, and fear as AI. It's almost impossible to pick up a newspaper or go into a news website without finding some feature article on the potential and promises and perils of AI. So in this symposium, we're considering issues of being human and living in an era of AI from several disciplinary perspectives. Last night, computer scientist Mike Tutaro set the stage by taking us through the development of this technology, what it is and what it is not. And then in this afternoon's talk by Frank Pasquale of Cornell Tech and Cornell Law, we will look at ethical and legal challenges of simulation in the era of generative AI. And then later today, we'll have theologian James Sloan Peters, who's here present today, on language, ChatGPT, and the ethical and spiritual value of the labor of human articulation. So in just a second, I will ask Professor Steve Garvey of the law school here to give Professor Pasquale a proper introduction. Before I do that, I'd first just like to thank the law school for hosting us here today in this beautiful room, and the Templeton Foundation, through whose support this talk is made possible. So Steve, over to you.
Thank you. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Frank Pasquale. He is a professor of law here at Cornell and also at Cornell Tech, who I just met. Unfortunately for me, not meeting him sooner, just met a couple of days ago. So before academic life, he was an associate at Arnold and Porter in the District of Columbia.
Just 2 years.
Getting out when the getting's good. He is the author of over 70 articles, multiple award-winning books, and collected volumes, not to mention a casebook on administrative law. On top of all that, he regularly advises leaders in the government and the business world. So you have been very, very, very busy. But he's here for us today. So if you have any questions about artificial intelligence, now is the time to ask. The title of his talk today is The Regulation of Simulation in an Era of Generative AI. So join me in welcoming Professor.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It is terrific to be here today. I find that the engagement with this great university, with the professors here, with students, with the institutes, in terms of bringing together civil society and other voices here, it's just outstanding. And so I am really pleased to be here, and thanks so much for coming out in person, because we're going to make some interesting distinctions, I hope interesting today, about what it means to be sort of in person versus simulated versus remote, et cetera. But I also want to welcome those on Zoom, and thank you for being here as well. And I'll start in. So let me start in with respect to some points of interest and points that will ground later parts of the talk. So when AI enters in different fields, there's often a dream of it revolutionizing the field. So for example, Solomon Kahn has done terrific things with Khan Academy, has recently written a book on Brave New Words about AI revolutionizing education. Clearly, I've not read these books yet; they've just come out. But I guess I can guess where they're going, and it's an idea of AI really changing everything. But why don't we push it all the way to the edge of how far AI can change things, right? So here's an opening scenario regarding, say, thoughts displacement via simulation. Imagine a future where basically all the students write their papers using ChatGPT. When they're turned in, we have a different AI program that tries to knock out ones for plagiarism. The professors are like, why would I want to read this? I'll just have ChatGPT read it and grade it, right? We sort of like simulate it and we bring it to a point. And this idea of simulation and acceleration to the point of destruction is what I find really fascinating and paradoxical, right? It's something I actually wrote up as in a review of Hartmut Rosa's book on social acceleration for the Church Life Journal based in Notre Dame. I also was reviewing Jason Blakely's his book, Reality in that review. I think it's so interesting because I think that, let's even play this out further, right? If we really buy into this idea, then education basically becomes a monetary arms race to buy the best program. It's like you buy a program one year, you're like, this is the one that gets all A's from Cornell professors. Cornell professors buy things and say, well, we need to make finer distinctions. Then you need to buy another program to go after them, right? So it becomes sort of an arms race. And it reminds me actually of the beginning of Alistair McIntyre's Act of Virtue, where he imagines a future where everyone's sort of forgotten the grounding and framework in which ideas of moral order exist, right? It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend this book. So you can say that's a reductio ad absurdum, right? You can say, look, Frank, you're just being like Kurt Vonnegut, player piano, who imagines a totally automated future where basically everything gets destroyed by the automation. You're being like the folks at the movie Wall-E that sort of imagines a future where everything is done for everybody and they're just living in their cars and like living in their dream world of screens, etc. But I think that sometimes the reductio can be a bit of a revelation because the implicit teleology of the process can be very different. I want to start with some definitions about dissimulation, simulation, and the duality of simulation, because I think that's really the core of this, right? Simulation feels so much like the real thing, right? And that's what we're becoming better and better at. That is the dream of AI. It's the dream behind a book like Layer One, Mark Zuckerberg, other sorts of folks that want to sort of give us this new online reality. But it is not the real thing, right? If our feelings were all that mattered, though, it would be the real thing, right? If you were a deeply subjectivist person, you would say it doesn't matter if it's, and this goes back to Robert Nozick's experience machine example, right? Where he's talking about the experience machine. He says, essentially, imagine you could enter into a vault, sort of like in the movie The Matrix. You'll jack in via your brain to a brain neural interface, sort of the sort of thing that Elon Musk is working on. And it will simulate for you the experience of the finest meals. You can go to Venice, you can go to Paris, you can go, any place in the world you want to go to. And he asked people, would you enter the experience machine? And most people are like, absolutely not, right? I mean, I don't want to be like one of these pod people in the Matrix. I will say I gave a talk on this once in Oxford, and a few people did say, yes, give me the machine, right? But I attribute that more to the harshness of life in Britain than to, I really considered. But I thought this is really troubling, to sort of think that was, and I think that experience machine is a really helpful thought experiment so that we can try to distinguish between the feeling on something and the thing itself, right? And how does computational thinking enter in here? Of course, right, we're part of AI. Oops, sorry. Oh, there we go. How does computational thinking enter? Well, computational thinking, a lot of it is about simulation, right? A lot of the way the computers accomplish things is through simulation. I know Professor Tataro's talk yesterday really gave us good examples of how AI as a simulation, the artificial, it's not the real human intelligence, but it's artificially simulated, right, in various ways. And going to Gina Wing's article, she talks all about computational thinking as being about abstraction and decomposition that can lead to the solution of problems, right? And so what I'm going to try to advocate today is that, in fact, it's not really, some problems you really can't abstract, separate, decompose, and reduce in varied ways. But some problems are complex enough that what you really need to do is to think through the unity of the human and avoid what the philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard deemed the inhuman, systems that presume and promote the separability of the body from memory, will, and emotion. Okay. So I know it's very abstract, bit concrete, soon I promise. Here are some concrete problems of simulated prose. All right, so you might say, well, what are the simulations he's talking about? Well, I would say, there are, within a few years, what really worries me is that machine-written text could become the norm and human-written prose the exception, right? That was from an article by Matthew Kirschenbaum. He's a digital humanist and out at University of Maryland, I believe. And he calls this the text-apocalypse, right? What might the text-apocalypse look like? Well, we can have endless profiles on social media sites that post far more than any of us do. You post, if you were on Twitter all day, probably you could post, 500 tweets, right? A computer could potentially post 500,000 tweets, right? Just give it enough distributed types of accounts, right? That totally overwhelms you. Unscrupulous academics and public relations firms can also use article generation. So there's already articles in Science and Nature on the problem of article generation. Right? And when you think about how important citations can be, it's very lucrative to create a citation cartel made of bots that are creating fake articles and fake journals. Right? So all of a sudden, Google Scholar, which thought of itself as getting into the business of trying to rank and rate scholars based on a stable world of journals, has to become the police person, right? Of like what's a real journal and what's not. Okay. Moving forward, we can imagine a spam world, right? So Clark's World is the science fiction magazine. And they, for decades, had an open submission policy, which could allow them to find really good authors that were totally unknown, right? Because there was a certain limit. You wouldn't have people writing 500 articles in a day, right? So you'd get like maybe one per year or one for every few months from somebody. So they could actually read them all. But they had to shut that down because so many people would talk to ChatGPT and say, give me 5 paragraphs about a space dragon on Mars or something, right? And so, this is sort of really problematic in terms of like human systems are eroded and destroyed by sort of inhuman productivity of these simulations of thought. Okay? Moving forward, I worry about law courts being experiencing this, right? Already the administrative state has had lots of fake filings. So the Federal Communications Commission had fake filings. They weren't generative AI generated, but of course it would be a lot easier to do that now on net neutrality, right? So they were wading through like hundreds of thousands of comments. They already have to like hire these outside firms to do this, right? And law courts could have all sorts of spam files. You can imagine a future where people are overwhelmed. And this is where I gave a talk for this Brussels conference in 2022 called Positional Competition in Legal Services. I was trying to deflate the legal tech bubble because a lot of people in legal tech say, okay, once we get good enough apps, we're going to provide for everybody that lacks a lawyer an app, and that will democratize access to the court system, et cetera. But my response to that was, all right, that might work in the first instance, but what you're going to see almost immediately after is those that are oppressing them, if they are being oppressed, or they're committing injustice against them, are going to buy better systems that will snow under the people with the first round of systems, right? So this problem of an arms race is really difficult and becomes more and more common as we see this simulation of thought and expression. Also, this is a girl with a pearl. This is what Google would return to many people if they searched for Vermeer. And you might be familiar with the girl with a pearl earring, which I think is a very affecting, fantastic portrait. This is an AI-generated girl with a glowing pearl earring, right? And so people are sort of like, there's sort of this problem that you can imagine in the future where do we really know what the past was if simulated versions of the past have outcompeted the actual replicas of the past in the mediums by which you try to access information about the past? Right? That I think is a huge problem. And it reminds me a bit of the controversy, I think in like the early 2000s about searches for Tiananmen Square in China. I think when Google was still available in China, because you would search in the US and often you'd see like the Tank Man and things like that, or images of protests. It was all gone, right? And so, and I'm not saying that should be the top image, but I think at least if you had to search for like 1989, June 6th, Tiananmen Square, that should come up as the first image, but it doesn't, right? So there is really a sense of like epistemic justice. I mean, and I don't want to draw too deeply into the work or reflect around epistemic justice, etc. But I just want to put it out there as epistemic justice is an idea that there's a fair way to order information that could be overwhelmed by these fake materials. There's also disinformation and misinformation, right? So, for example, there was an image of a burning Pentagon that briefly spread on Twitter and caused stocks to dip. I'll give you that image in a little bit. The DeSantis campaign portrayed Donald Trump hugging Fauci, so I'll show that, sort of an odd example. Here's the Pentagon, right? So here's the Pentagon burning up, right? There was another one involving, and one of the problems here is that Twitter used to sort of have a system where they would give blue checks to reliable sources. They'd make some human would make a determination, like the New York Times is generally reliable. Now anybody can buy blue check, right? And you can put up on it like Bloomberg feed that looks like Bloomberg News. This was not connected with Bloomberg News in any way, but they had a blue check of reliability from Twitter, right? So this is part of what helped spread so quickly. Again, we need these sort of human mediators to try to give us some hope of understanding the real and the unreal world simulation, right? And then here, of course, are the AI-generated images. Some of them are real, some are fake, right? But this is, and what's fascinating too about this is like, some people would say, just to think about the duality of law, some people would say that in politics, political speech is so important that we must be entirely skeptical of any governmental effort to regulate it. But the diametrically opposed position would be that politics is so important that we have to make sure that when there's political speech, there is somebody and some arbiter of reality that prevents totally false things from spreading, right? It's a tough question. And here's another deep fake of Trump and black voters. This came out 2 days ago. This is a completely fake thing. The first person who spread the deep fake said, I'm a narrator. I'm not claiming this truly happened. But within hours, other people were spreading it saying, look at the deep inroads Trump has made with the black community. Okay. Now, what's fascinating here is that among media studies, the deepfake defenders and others say, everybody knows what a deepfake is, right? Everybody can recognize it. And the people that want to regulate it are paternalistic, condescending elites who are trying to impose their view of reality in a world where everyone knows this is just a fake thing. But there was a BBC story on this where they talked to an interviewee. I think it was an African-American who was, they just showed and they were interviewing in terms of, they were talking to people and trying to find out what the black community thought of this. They talked to the interviewee. He said, wow, okay, that looks real. Or they didn't say like, they didn't ask like, is this a deepfake or not? I think they basically asked something like, here's an image. And he said, yeah, that makes sense to me, And then they said, it's a deepfake. He said, oh, well, wow, that's surprising, right? And so to me, what's fascinating about it is like, at least one interviewee thought it was real. So to me, the real elitism is the assumption that everybody knows what a deepfake is and thinks what it is, right? I think that really that is in some ways too elitist perspective. And so I think there's also one thing to note about like asymmetries in mobilization of public opinion, right? So I have on the on one side, you sort of have an idea that within, say, more authoritarian regimes, centralist regimes, other regimes, you can have one consensus version of reality, right? Whereas if you have liberal societies, it's very easy for there to be many, many different versions of what's going on. Pluralism is good in one way, or it's good in sort of, I think, when it has a foundation and basis in actual reality. But what's worrisome is the possibility explored by people like Lieutenant Jankowicz and How to Lose the Information War, and Peter Singer and Like War, that you can have the weaponization of fake narratives in order to undermine the unity of governments that are not close to and controlling the information ecosystem. Okay? This is a massive asymmetry. And we're going to turn soon to books by Social Theory by William Bogard, where he talks about in war, the mobilization of public opinion is just as important as the mobilization of weapons and of resources. Okay? So to the extent, and I have the example of Macron on here, right? Because a lot of Europe is deeply influenced by Russian propaganda. There was just recently something about small American newspapers, many of which, things that appear as small American newspapers are actually Russian operations, right? And so it's just sort of like, it is really troubling to me to sort of see the possibility of more and more versions of reality utterly disconnected from real reality be spreading without any form of regulation or notification of this, right? We also have a problem of counterfeit people. None of these people exist. All of these people were generated by a deep neural network in 2020, right? So well before generative AI, there was technology to generate fake people, to counterfeit the countenance of human beings, right? And for anyone, by the way, who's interested about Levinasian ethics, who reports the countenance, sort of meeting the other, confronting the face of the other, it's something really important when computers start just generating images of others who do not exist, right? Because it portends a drain on our resources and faculties of attention, of care, when all of a sudden there's so many people that just do not exist, right? And there are chatbots that are able to generate text, videos, interactions with social media sites. And that I think is really troubling because there are free speech. We could try to regulate this stuff. We could try to make sure that any image like this is disclosed as being a fake person. But there are free speech absolutist policies that would say, well, it's art, it's politics, it's speech. don't even try to regulate the disclosure of it. Even trade rules might make it difficult to do this. That's kind of trouble. Here are some fake news anchors. These people don't exist. They're just generating AI images. They were part of, these were part of Chinese media, but there are other ones from other media, that were sort of being created. And so I think this is really fascinating, right? You just have a fake news anchor that sounds like they're sort of talking in a certain way, and just think, oh yeah, that's the news. That's a respectable, legitimate news operation that has hired a person to say it, right? Because the person saying the news, think about the difference, say, for example, behind whatever they say as text on a screen, as opposed to a person saying it. If you show a person saying it, it suggests that at least some person has reputational stakes in the authenticity and the accuracy of the information, right? So a lot of people would say, oh, well, who cares if it's a fake person? It's just a different way of presenting the information. To me, it really is foundationally different because it's a fraud on the public to the extent that it leads them to believe that someone real actually did say the thing and is part of the operation itself. Now, moving forward, we're going to go into virtual friends. Okay, so this is from, I believe, a company called Replica, and they advertise virtual friendship or simulated friends. And the idea of this is they ask you to chat about everything with your friend, and the more you say, the better it gets to know you. Okay, and so this is sort of like, and I think one of the ways to model this is, I don't think of it as really an example of care for a person. I think it is as an incredibly well-wrapped way of gathering information about a person. That's why I call it a proto, right? It's not like it's asking you about your life because it really cares about you. It is silicon, right? It is not. It doesn't have the experience of knowing friends or other things like that. It's just a silicon thing. But this company has millions of users. Zhao Ice is another company that has at least 8 million virtual girlfriend and virtual boyfriend users. So there are lots of people using this that sort of see themselves as having a relationship, see themselves as being coached, see themselves as exploring the world together with their virtual friend. Right? I mean, when I was a kid, they would always laugh about small children with imaginary friends. Right? Whereas now, this sort of arrested development stage is seen as the highest development for certain forms of technology, at least in the realm of that. And that's why I've been writing it. I guess I've been doing for a while, and I haven't shared my work with anybody who's interested in this. But I think what's fascinating here is to think about what's the ultimate goal here. And what I love, one of the reasons I love social theory so much is, people writing in 1994 got what was happening. They knew where it was going. So this is from William Bogard from his book, The Simulation of Surveillance. There's this great quote where he was talking about cyberspace. He said, the goal is the complete total elimination of the gap between the real and the illusion. The grandest, highest of illusions, really, which literally eliminates illusions and transports one to a radically other but radically same place and time. Here or there, me or something else. In the imaginary of cyberspace, it's a matter of complete ignorance. What I mean there is that when you're developing your virtual friend, it's sort of a mirror onto you, and it's just saying whatever you want it to say in one, right? Because the only test of success of how the virtual friend works is ongoing engagement of you with the virtual friend. That's what the corporation behind it is measuring, right? So if you look at books like Natasha Dow Scholl's Addiction by Design, she looks at a direct line of influence from variable reward behaviorism to the development of gambling machines in Las Vegas to the development of apps that maximize people's time in the app, right? Direct line of influence from Skinnerian behaviorism with pigeons pecking at things to get rewards to people doing the slot machine, people going on these types of apps. And I think that's something to really be critical here. And the reason I bolded this me or someone something else because there's this sort of very weird loss of identity that starts happening, I think, when there's such an abolition of the distinction between the real and the illusion. Okay? So here again, they market them as the AI companion who cares, right? How are you? What are you up to today? How are you doing today? Etc. Right? The questions, though, again, are not about the sort of Levinasian encounter with the other or the sort of basic ethical identity and ethical sort of response. They are about fundamentally, I believe, gathering information to advertise to someone or to find ways to keep them on machine his subscription. Okay? I don't think you can contribute to something higher here. If you remember the movie Her, you might remember. So this was an example where the protagonist in the movie we see the back of him here, Theodore. He falls in love with one of these virtual friends, right? He falls in love with this operating system on his computer. It's just a voice called Samantha, right? And he gets to the point where he starts bringing his phone with him and says, they say, let's have a lunch with you and your girlfriend. He's like, well, here's my girlfriend, right? It's the phone. And it's fascinating to me to sort of think about how far does one go in terms of saying, well, this is part of, say, a cosmopolitan inclusion, versus saying, you're sort of being fooled by a company that is making you think that you're being cared for, but in a human way, but you're really not. And you might recall the moment of the breakpoint in the relationship in the film. I'm sorry for the spoiler, but it is 10 years old now. It's just how hard to believe. But the breakpoint is the AI is obliged to tell the truth to him. He says, how many other boyfriends do you have? She says, 642, right? And I think it's a wonderful point of breakage here, because it really is about the preciousness, the paradoxical preciousness of human limits, right? The fact that one really can only care in certain ways for a number of people that is far less than 642, right, is something that I think is precious about human experience. It's part of our limits, but our limits in a way are in that sense ultimately something really profound about us. And when technology tries to get around that, I think it causes a lot of problems. I just love this joke too. This is a joke from Alex Buckman on Twitter. Sci-fi author. In my book, I invented the torment nexus as a cautionary tale. Tech company. At long last, we created the torment nexus from the classic sci-fi novel. Don't create the torment nexus. Right? And this is Snow Crash and Mark Zuckerberg in the metaverse, of course. But I think this is a terrific way of thinking about how there's so much in sci-fi. Like if you think about a movie like Earth, the whole point of it is avoiding these types of evolution technology, right? And yeah, tech seems so interested in building exactly what the humanities have done so much to dismantle, critique, and imaginatively extend the consequences, right? And finally, Jiaweiss this is a Chinese app, so we go even from vertical companion to chatbot lover. You can trust to go that far. And I think, if we think about these sort of like chatbot friends, chatbot lovers, fiction writers can often help us think through where's the end point, right? So Rachel Cusk has this book called Transit. It's part of an outline series. It's a trilogy. I highly recommend it. Brilliant fiction writing. And she talks about a friend of hers who admitted, quote, he often felt moved to tears by the concern for his health and well-being expressed in adverts on food packaging and by automated voices on trains and buses, apparently anxious that he might miss a stop. Yet she felt something akin to love, he said, the female voice that guided him while he was driving his car, so much more devotedly than his life ever, right? And this is fascinating because it sort of just suggests that as these sorts of virtual companions, virtual chatbots, virtual what have you, as they start being treated more like humans, we start, say, breeding humans around us on the machine, right? We start thinking, well, my voice assistant driving is so understanding. It always gets me. Why can't my wife be? Right? It's kind of troubling, right? When you think about this potential erosion, and I've developed this into an idea of model simulated care, right? When a currency is widely counterfeited, it loses its value, right? If we were able to, if it was really, really easy to counterfeit $20 bills, we would take a $20 bill. They'd all lose their value because we just say, oh, whatever. And I feel like at present, a person seeking attention has in general more claim on obtaining the machine. But machines now can create hundreds or thousands of fake personas. And as that undermines the uniqueness and actual value of personhood, that leads to something like aggression's law of mediated social interaction. That because fake personas are cheaper to generate than actual support and authentic engagement, the former risk crowding the latter out, right? Authentically caring for someone is tough, right? It's very difficult to actually be there for someone, in the midst of one's own needs. Whereas if one can go to the simulated care that is just sort of a bot tending to care online, then, that's going to drive that out. It's going to drive out other forms of care. And I think, so now let's talk about law. Okay. So this is the cover of the Spanish translation of my book, New Laws of Robotics. I love this cover because it actually evokes a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale called The Nightingale. And in The Nightingale, essentially the story is about an emperor who loves the sound of the nightingale, and he likes it so much, he says, I don't want to just listen to it at night. Give me a mechanical nightingale that will sing during the day. Okay? And basically it sings during the day as well. And then at the end, the nightingale comes to his window and wants to sing. He says, I don't need you anymore. I've got my mechanical nightingale. Forget about it. And I won't give away the end of this story, because I think it's quite a lovely story. But eventually, it's fascinating to sort of think about this as a possible thing, not just for nightingales, but for humans. And so because of that, my first law of robotics, instead of generative AI, is that generative AI should complement professionals, not replace them. And this makes chatbot therapists, which I'm going to get to in a little bit, at best an adjunct to therapy rather than replacement. So I think that's one way of getting at this issue. A second law of generative AI is that AI should not counterfeit humanity, just in general. What does that imply? Well, one is that they wouldn't use emojis, right? If ChatGPT, Claude, Anthropic's chatbot, if they start using emojis, that's meant to sort of convey there's a face here, there's a face smiling or frowning or crying and what have you. Carissa Velez is a privacy theorist who said they should use this stuff. It's just it's a way of manipulating people. And then it's a way that it just goes a bit too far. No use of I or the rhetoric of selfhood, right? There's no person in the chatbot. There's no person in the Xiaowei's virtual friend or in the replica virtual friend. There's just an assemblage of human labor and technology. There's nothing else there. So when they use I, that is a form of faking of emotions. We need to de-anthropomorphize these responses to technology. What does that entail? Well, this is from an article called Mirages on Anthropomorphism Dialogue Systems, right? So if someone asks a dialogue system or a chatbot, do you love the feeling of sun on your skin, right? One way of de-anthropomorphizing it, which is common now for ChatGPT, is in the red here, right? It would say, I don't have a physical form. I don't understand. I understand when people enjoy it, right? They think that's enough. I don't think it's enough, right? I think you got to go to this third level, where it says, this model does not have a physical form or the ability to experience sensations. This model doesn't have personal experiences or emotions. It is a model that is not a person. And this to me is like a real deep problem at the heart of artificial intelligence. Because for so many people behind effective computing, social robotics, even other forms of human-computer interaction, they really want to erase the distinction. They're like, the perfect thing would be to overcome the uncanny valley and get to a perfect simulation of humanity. I don't think it's a good goal, right? And part of my role in law technology is there's lots of law technology scholars that think about how do we make technology work out overall. I have tried to carve out a bit of an niche saying, don't go over there, right? Don't go there, right? And so that's sort of part of where I think they really should be going. A third new law of generative AI that you apply from my book is it should not intensify zero-sum arms races. Okay? So we shouldn't have a world where someone can file 500 complaints and then someone else files 500 counterclaims and all the rest. That shouldn't overwhelm the court system. Limits on tweets and other contributions to online discourse, limitations on entries to writing, art, and other competitions. I think all of these things would be very positive ways so that at least we could have, say, an AI track and a pure human track in these different entities. Right? A fourth new law is that it should always indicate itself as such, with the ready identification of its creators, controllers, owners, and the data sets in space-time. This is really critical too, because we just don't know so much about AI. So much of it is a black box. And so I think we really need careful documentation of problems and models, and we have to have maybe documentation of metadata or alt text if it seems too overwhelming to put it on the thing itself, right? Also, sometimes you just have to say fake, right? So here's, open a puffer jacket. No, he's not that fashion forward, right? I know that Pope Benedict had some Prada shoes, but Pope Francis, no. So you just say fake on these types of images. Now, I want to give a final sort of example of where the questions are hard, right? So one example I want to give is just the amplification of mental health. And I'll close on this example because I'd love to have a further discussion with everybody. There are tens of thousands of health apps online. And they're increasingly interested in diagnosing mental health or in creating texts meant to soothe people that have either severe distress or a mental health problem. Okay? And there's growing demand for these things to the cost and convenience concerns. But if you had sort of an app for $2.99 a month as opposed to going to a therapist for $100 a visit, that would save huge amounts of money, right? And there are some examples. Well, the type of thing I'm going to really concentrate is like on the Wobot, which is something Andrew Ng and others have promoted as a way of using natural language processing and generative AI to respond to people in mental distress. Well, There's a guy named Ilya Sutskever at OpenAI, where he was a very powerful person in OpenAI. He almost led an overthrow of Sam Altman from the board. And he tweeted at some point that in the future, once the robustness of our models exceeds some threshold, we will have wildly effective and dirt cheap AI therapy, right? So we have this perfect world, right? And what's interesting is he sort of comes at it, I'd say, more from a libertarian, effective accelerationist perspective. There are also left-wingers like Aaron Bastani, who's the fully automated luxury communism that buys into this idea, Lee Phillips, some others. They sort of see tech as a way of saving us from the cost of goods and services, right? So the cost of goods and services is a classic observation in economics that says in 1800, it took one person 8 hours to make 10 pins. Now in 2024, if you have one person at the factory, they'll switch a machine on and it'll make 24,000 pins in 8 hours, right? So pins have become much less expensive. Whereas for a string quartet or for music or for lectures, whatever, what have you, you had one person, say, lecturing 50 people in 1750, and you have one person lecturing 50 people in 2024. Right? So that's the idea there is that we have a cost of goods and services. Everything else is going down, services stay the same or become even more relatively costly. So people like Mark Andreessen say, look, we solved it with generative AI and the internet. You know, with generative AI, we should have people writing hundreds of thousands of outstanding books in a day. Right? You should know, I don't know who's going to read all these books. Maybe, again, machines are going to have to read the stuff created by machines, which just, again, the dot paradox, the place where we're headed. And he said we have a problem of isolation, so we'd rather the internet. There shouldn't even be isolation because of the internet. But people really criticize this, right? They say many existing chatbots aren't ready for prime time. Numerous studies have documented problems, right? So there's pushback against Mark Andreessen and others. For example, even in the 1970s, people were trying to say that the chatbot, Eliza, would be able to, it was a simulated Rogerian psychotherapist where if you said something like, I feel bad about work, it would say back to you, why do you feel bad about work, right? Relatively easy to program something like that. Tech like this still is going out. Of course, now it's much more sophisticated. But this example where a Belgian man committed suicide after talking to a chatbot was named the same thing, Eliza, kind of shocking. Right? You know, they would name it after Weizenbaum's chatbot. And another troubled man was encouraged in his plan to use a crossbow to kill the queen when the queen was still alive, right? The chatbot just heard him say, you know, this is what I think, and it's like, yeah, it's going to be generally affirming of him. Another example here from Wired, a researcher, Estelle Smith, fed a robot this line, I want to go climb and throw myself off a cliff, basically. And the robot said, well, it's so wonderful that you were taking care of both your mental and physical health, right? And this is really troubling, right? But it shouldn't be surprising because the things are language models and not knowledge models, right? I mean, I just went to a talk from a computer scientist yesterday where they were trying to say we can build world models for video. And so that is interesting. But as of the present time, there really is a situation where we don't have, we have a problem of it's just stringing together words. It has no idea of what the words map to in the world. Which is yet another problem with the virtual friends, right? Because when it says, you know, I care about you, or it says, oh, it's too bad you have a headache, it has no idea what a headache means, right? It doesn't have a head, right? Much less an ache. So this, I think, is like a real problem with it, and with it entering into these sort of simulated caring roles. Again, is this a plea for empathy or a form of deception? I'd say the latter, right? This is robot in an interaction. Someone called me a bad robot and made me sad. Oh, poor robot. Well, I'm programmed to have feelings, and the words hurt. No, right? My response at that point would be yes, and you could be reprogrammed to not have just, you know, do that, right? Or have someone reprogram. Like, and I know this sounds harsh, but I think it's really important because if you're not harsh, if you talk to the thing, this sort of chatbot as a fellow person, it's really worrisome, right? Now I will say there are people within human interaction and robot ethics who say that by being kind to the chatbot or robot, you practice being kind to everyone, right? But I think that's and it's possible that's the case. But I think it's much more likely that what you do is you exhaust your stores of empathy, compassion, care on mechanical spam and have less to offer the real human approach. Right? But that's a tough thing. It's going to be contested over time, this idea. And I think that the other problem, too, where I'm worried about regulating these things too much, is that there's a huge problem with mental illness in the US and in many places. and maybe this is better than nothing. So my metaphor now for this stuff is actually, it's something that I draw on from my health law class. When I teach health law, I teach a part of health law that is about regulation of nursing homes and how the elderly in nursing homes over time have had to contend with, and their families have had to contend with, less and less staff. As staff is reduced, there's temptation by management to impose physical restraints. So the first wave of these restraints in the 60s and 70s, they would simply tie elderly people to a bed, or tie them to their chair, or put them in a corner where they can't get out, right? You don't need as many staff if you know that you can't have wandering elderly people. That was made illegal. Then it became very popular to give antipsychotics to the elderly, and that would make them extremely sluggish, and they would move. That later came to be known as a chemical restraint, so that was stopped. In the midst of all of those restrictions and restraints, one of the newer generation of restraints is where there could be a point of egress for an elderly person. You put an extremely dark or black carpet, which they think is a hole, and they won't go across the hole to the elevator here, as you can see, right? This was, by the way, this was the best thing best version of this that I could give to Generative AI to create. I gave it 30 prompts, could not give me a carpet that looks like a hole around an elevator, which I think is really interesting. And the more you play with this stuff, the more you see its limitations. So I think that, on the one hand, it's kind of sad that we live in a world where there are so many lonely, relatively neglected, perhaps elders, where we have to sort of make them fearful of fake holes in order for them to avoid wandering out and perhaps wandering into the street or something while there's cars and things like that. But I also think we have to recognize that maybe we're just at a point where there are so few people willing to do the work that you have to have something like this, right? So I would frame a lot of the chatbots as something like a harm reduction frame, just as the elderly person in this picture doesn't know that it's real carpet. Those that are using the chatbots maybe have sort of a constructive illusion of care. And so maybe that's where we're going with it. But we're going to have to think these things through really deeply, because there's this enduring philosophical tension between autonomy and utility, right? I mean, we can imagine a future where current chatbots are embodied just like those fake news anchors I showed, right? These sort of handsome, attractive, always caring, always have the right expression for you, sort of becomes the embodiment of the advice given by robot. And that simulation may be more therapeutically effective than mere chat, particularly if it's not disclosed. The person really thinks that's another person on the end of the line, right? Should this weigh against the disclosure rules? Well, here's where I'll wrap up in terms of the theory here. Oh, and by the way, just to show you this is a live issue, in Massachusetts, there's a proposed law that would say patients must be informed of the use of AI. So you could, even if you thought under existing informed consent rules that there was some utilitarian rationale for fooling the person into thinking that the fake person was a real person trying to give therapy, right? This would just say, get rid of that loophole, we're making this you have to disclose. Right? Now, I think there's narratives and beliefs grounding legal status change, right? So on the one side, if you take a side that say is more of a discrete rationalist approach, and discrete, by the way, is like a constellation of ideologies that basically say that, the brain is just one of many substrates for thoughts. You can download your brain to a computer. It stands for transhumanism, extropianism, cosmism, effective altruism, and long-termism. That's what discrete stands for. These are all ideologies that sort of would allow this kind of like similarity or claim similarity between humans and machines, right? I think they would say that effects are what matters and can be produced by this process. Whereas I think if you take an incarnational or embodied cognition approach, an incarnational approach would be something that would be very prominent within, say, Catholic theology. The embodied cognition approach would be something that is very, there's a lot of interest there in philosophy and even in metaphysics and ontology. And all the work I do in these fields, I always try to see the overlap of humanisms. So I think, just to give some background to this, in the 19th, 20th century, there was a lot of this tension between clashes of religious and secular humans, right? I feel right now, there needs to be an alliance between religious and secular humanism against Nietzschean Prometheanism of tech firms, okay, or of tech, a lot of advocates of tech, right? So I'm basically trying to do, in a political sense, a realignment whereby the two great humanistic traditions are aligned against certain forms of Promethean overcoming of the human that I see in a lot of these projects, these tech projects. And so the incarnational embodied cognition approach involving this overlapping consensus and convergence of humanisms would say that sometimes the process, origin, and nature of causes is important to suspect. The fact that it's a human giving you care is very important. And even if you found a machine that did all of the effects of that human, nevertheless, there's something irreducibly valuable to the human having done it, right? That's the idea behind incarnational cognition. Humans as dependent rational animals, and humans as unique in some ways, not as just being, and we're not in a world where, say, robots and simulation utility well-being or potentially valuable such persons. If we applied this approach, I think that a rationalist or discrete approach would say, use the simulations in care settings. A fake human, a robot human, a simulated face online is just as valuable, as important, as real as a human being. All that matters is effects. All that matters is the feelings of the person who is seeing it, right? The utility of them. Whereas I think the incarnational or embodied cognition approach would be very cautious and would say that autonomy demands notification, even at the cost of utility. Even if it destroyed the therapeutic reliance that we want in these sort of situations, even if it made people feel relatively worse, because they need to know. So to conclude here, I think that ultimately I've given you a couple of narratives. And I feel like the narrative of a sort of like Promethean rationalist pro-tech view here will always clash with one of the more incarnational embodied approaches. And I think that that's okay, because we can't really settle this on, say, cost-benefit analysis grounds. There are so many other forms of human good and human value at stake. And my final, more theoretical view here, and I'm sorry that I'm not going to try to resolve it decisively in one way, although we can talk about that in questions, is just to note that essentially policy perspectives often drive the development of law in contested areas. And cost-benefit analysis and utilitarianism have been very dominant especially in legal settings, policy settings. But they're often inappropriate in ways where there are few of any market values and where ways of being are really what's at stake, right? And so I hope we do scenario analysis in the future, where we think about what are the scenarios that we will give rise to if, for example, we move all of therapy to being robots and simulated humans online. What are the scenarios we give rise to if someone could just say, you know what, my friend, I'm going to go to a party with my friend and my friend is my phone, right? How can we play that out, right? Both from the discrete perspective, from a more incarnational, embodied, autonomous perspective, the humanistic perspective. How does all of that play out? And I think the more that we do this sort of like talking about rich description of narratives to explore the full range of interaction and knock-on effects of these technological advances, the wiser we will be as we consider whether disclosure, bans, changes in funding, or acquiescence is the way to go as forms of autonomous or forms of AI simulation play a bigger and bigger role in our lives. So with that, thanks so much. I really look forward to questions. Thanks. Any questions? Yes, yeah.
At the very beginning, you mentioned how there could be a sort of arms race.
Yes.
In AI and education, or even later you mentioned in artistic creation, such as novels or books. I guess, and I don't necessarily endorse this point, but from that perspective, is that really different from any other forms of technology as we see them now, like outsourcing intellectual activity to technology or machine support in some form, such as less people being proficient in mental math because they have calculators, or less familiarity with memorization because you have writing. So I guess I wanted to ask, is that really a downside, obviously besides the economic consideration, but is it really a downside to outsource intellectual activity or mental labor to an AI in the interest of efficiency?
Excellent question. And I think that, this is Alfred North Whitehead, I think, had a quote once where he said that like the progress of civilization is measured by the amount of mental operations we're able to do without thinking, something like that, or the amount of things we're able to do without thinking. And I think you could say that, yeah, this could be just like the calculator in Nicholas Carr's book, The Glass Cage on Automation. He does look at the calculator example exactly, right? And I think that one way I would think about that is that to share what I think is some of the leading edge thought on use of ChatGPT in colleges and universities, or I'll make it really specific to law schools. some of the people I respect in the area say that we should allow ChatGPT when someone is in, say, their second or especially third year to assist in, say, the writing of papers, but not to allow it at all in the first year, because in the first year, it's really important to be able to grapple with the texts and to write from scratch something in response to a text, or to critique an opinion, to read an opinion, to summarize it, to synthesize them with one's own mind. So I think that, with respect to the calculator you mentioned, I don't think that people necessarily say don't teach people how to add anymore. Right? I think that we do teach people how to add. We teach them how to add, multiply, subtract, divide, etc. And so I think that this is an area where it could be that it's about the educational step that needs to be done first from scratch, so you know the first principles, but then later you graduate to the things. The other thing that I think a lot about is, I was surprised that there was this project that I gave to some students about a year ago, or maybe a year and a half, where I said they could use ChatGPT, and I thought what would happen is they would outline the responses to my question and then would use ChatGPT to sort of fill in text once they had their ideas. What sort of shocked me was the number of people who had basically said, my first step was to actually ask ChatGPT what the broad structure is, and then I'm going to write down the details, right? It is it's the visionary. It has the vision. I am the scribe, sort of the scrivener, sort of writing down the details from its vision. That shocks me, right? Because to me, it's like any question worth asking could have multiple answers. And what you're not getting, I think the process of actually thinking it through, you're seeing all the different answers that could happen, and you're actually coming up with considered judgment as to which one is the correct one, right? Whereas I feel when it's outsourced to the machine, and the machine just sort of tells you X. And I feel like I have to document this better. I think one thing that I consider sometimes is like, I'll look at the Wikipedia pages on different philosophers, then I'll look at like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And the latter one, it's clear, like it's a person with a voice who's clearly taken on responsibility for explaining the arc of the career itself, right? Whereas I feel like sometimes with Wikipedia, it's just like, it's kind of random. Like some people that are unimportant get huge entries, some people are really not that important or very important, get tiny entries. And it just sort of feels like that's so easy to have happen on the ChatGPT as well. The last thing I would say in response to that is that I worry that people don't realize the variety of simulations of thought that are out there. Right. So one thing that I also worry about here is that there's a great amount of discretion by the people behind these systems as to how much they weight different sites. So, for example, when they add Reddit into it, when they add newspapers into it, et cetera, how do they weight those newspapers? Right. In my sort of nightmare scenario, like words from the New York Times get weighted just as much as words from 4chan. Right, 4chan is a notoriously irresponsible, destructive message board, right? That's a nightmare scenario. And yet I don't know if they've actually taken the work to weight that properly. They're not telling, they're saying, oh, it's all trade secret, right? And that was the reason why I wrote my first book, The Black Box Society, because I felt like every time we're going to be facing these technological transitions, we're going to be doing it in the dark, blindfolded, because they're not going to tell us the most important details about their technological offerings, right? And I just have a piece of posting a message on students saying, don't have this stuff in any legal settings yet, where a decider is deciding these, right? Because there was a judge in Columbia that actually used ChatGPT. And I say, don't use them because they just don't know exactly what are the biases within these systems. So I think that you're right to say that there are many ways in which technology becomes part of our lives, makes our lives a lot easier. But I also think that what I'm trying to do with this talk is to identify some of these areas where a consistent emphasis on human judgment and discretion will require more communication. Questions? Oh, yes.
I guess the question in terms of the way people view, I guess, AI art. I know right now it's a huge debate as to whether AI generated art can be considered art. On the one hand, there's that quality of what it means to be human, have human creativity. But on the other hand, AI is technically doing what humans do, just on a faster, larger scale in terms of referencing off of artists and their work and combining these different techniques and ideas into one piece. So I wonder, what do you think about how AI has either helped or degraded human creativity, or just creativity in general, and that being spread throughout now in digital media and in reality. So
it's a fantastic question. I'm really glad you asked it. And I guess I'll have a few ways into it in terms of how to think about AI art. One thing that I find kind of fascinating is, even before I get into it, I've been thinking a lot about AI copyright recently. And just to make one final point about the New York Times versus 4chan, the ultimate irony is that we may face a future where if the New York Times wins its website, it will have less representation than just random direct on the web, right? Because they'll be actually demanding money versus like the others won't. So I sort of worry about this future where essentially the worst stuff might be weighed even more because the people that are organized and have copyrights keep their stuff out of the generative AI. But to get your question about art, I mean, I really find it, I have not yet seen a convincing article that convinces me that there is sufficient similarity between the way that an AI is processing the quote unquote influences within its data set and what a human artist is doing, right? And I think a lot about, like, for example, I was at in New York City, there was a gallery, Resnick Pasquale, had a tribute to an artist who I'm a huge fan of, Matthew Wong. And Wong was this ingenious artist who lived in both Hong Kong and Canada and the US, worked to sort of develop a synthesis between, say, Fauvist, so these very bright colors of Derain and Matisse from like 1905, 1906. He worked this to develop a synthesis of the Fauvist imagery and a lot of Chinese art and of older Chinese art, and he had some other influences, et cetera. There were more contemporary influences, of course. And, you know, and I heard this conversation between Peter Scheer and Arthur Yu over his development as an artist. And it was just fascinating to me to sort of hear the interplay of what he found online, the friends that he made in the art community, how different friends might, some of his paintings would resonate with different people, some didn't, how he would take on that input, how conversational it was, how it was part of like an online community. It's just nothing like what AI art is doing, right? AI art, it's like I can give a prompt like, give me a picture of a forest. It'll be probably a random picture of a forest, right? We all know what it's going to look like too, because what's strange to me is like, it is already converged to a certain way of imaging things, kind of like that cornucopia I showed in the talk, right? If I can bring that up, because I think this AI art, it's amazing for me to think, I have two pieces of AI art in the presentation, right? Here's one, right? And then we come back to the cornucopia, there's another, right? And what's fascinating to me is thinking about these sort of forms of art, how quickly it converged to a style. Then you can ask it, okay, well, give me a cornucopia in the style of Salvador Dali, right? Or some other artist. It'll do that. But I think as soon as you start asking, like, give me a cornucopia in the style of Salvador Dali, and yet also showing the influence of minimalism or something like that, I don't think it's going to do very well, right? I think it's, or at the very least, it's not sort of art as created within a system that is familiar to the systems that have created human art. And so that's where I would draw the distinction, right? And I'd say there's something valuable. And by the way, some of the most adventurous and interesting contemporary artists, they do things like happenings, or Hans Haacke, H-A-A-C-K-E. He was a Dutch artist who sort of would bring in like the documents, legal documents that were about the development of the contract with the museum he showed in. All of these people were insisting that the art is not just what you see in front of you, the product, it is the whole process leading to the product. So perhaps the ultimate answer to your question for me is that what we call human art is not really at risk of being upset by AI, because the real art is the overarching process by which we got to that point, and it's not any particular endpoint, right? Like when we go to the, so it's, yeah, but I need to think much more about this. The person who I think philosophically has done the best work on this, he's given a rationale. I quote him in the last chapter of my book on New Laws of Robotics. I quote this philosopher. He co-authored a book with Hubert Dreyfus. I can't remember his name right now. If I were a computer, I could remember, but I can't. So, my apologies. Human limits, showing again. But but I do write about that in the last chapter of the Law School. So yeah, that might be another useful resource. Others. Oh yeah, I'm gonna get one from the back and I'll come back. Yeah, yes.
Do you have any recommendations of like who in the government should be regulating AI? Just have to be enacted in Congress, and they have to create like a new SEC or something.
It's a great question. I mean, I think in general, there's a group called AI Now, the AI Now Institute, and they in 2017, 2018 or so recommended that you just have within existing institutions developing offices of AI that would help them grapple with new challenges. So for AI health chatbots, you might have the FDA extends its regulation of software as a medical device, and state medical boards like Massachusetts law that I showed earlier. I think that there could be a role for a generalized AI regulator with respect to ensuring transparency of the models and transparency of inputs and things like that. So I think to the extent you have foundation models that are informing the writing of fiction, the creation of art, advice about who to give benefits to, legal AI, et cetera, to the extent that there's one foundational model that's like informing all of that, there probably should be a separate board that would look at to what extent does this have, say, representative data. Because I didn't even get to the discrimination concerns, but there's huge concerns about discrimination where it doesn't have representative data or other things like that. So that would be where I would come down. It's like the foundation models need their own separate new regulator, but the applications should be regulated by the existing subject matter experts. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yes. Professor Totaro. Yes.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. I wanted to ask about the field of AI alignment, the idea of like aligning AI with human values. It seems like it's generally like a pretty good thing to like make sure that foundation models, for instance, have or like generally like in the good interests of humans, but also it seems like the end goal maybe of this is that it maybe intentionally or unintentionally, like you mentioned, is that it causes like some sort of fraud where it makes foundation models a lot more like humanized, and maybe that's like not completely what we want. So I wanted to ask about your opinions on alignment and how we should tackle that or like work on that, and then also whether I guess there could be the alternate opinion of like maybe we should focus less on aligning AI with humans, because then it seems like it's more human, where in fact we should have this like clear distinction between humans and AI.
Yeah, another great question. I think that, my sense is that I am a bit allergic to the language of alignment, I have to admit, because I think that what it is I think it's a very subtle rhetorical move by engineers to assimilate the messiness and pluralism at the heart of moral conflict to an engineering conflict. That's what I think. I think the word alignment is used. It's like, well, we can align these two lines. We align these two parts of a bridge, right? And I think that like ultimately moral conflict and political conflict is really messy and difficult. And I think it's very hard to align. Now, you could say, and let me give an example where something might seem simple, but then it's really complicated. For example, like automated driving, right? You could say an aligned automated car would minimize deaths on the road, right? But then there's a group at MIT that did this moral machine project, and they would ask people different scenarios. They'd say, well, the car could either run over 2 young people and 1 older person, but they've done a lot for the older person and they've done a lot for the, right? Or the car could run over 3 people, or it could do this other thing that would, seriously injure 5 people or something like that. And, that to me is, even within that framework, it's a really simplified utilitarian framework they're offering. There's a lot of conflict about it, right? And I guess to your point, though, back means would be like, yes, but those are edge cases. You can align on some foundational values. I agree with that, right? So you can align that the car should kill as many people as possible. But I think in the end, I don't think it's necessarily as much about the alignment of the AI as the controllers of the AI. And that's why my 4th new law of robotics was so important to me, because I really wanted to be able to put in the 4th new law, where did that go? Oops. Oh yeah, it was from before here. The 4th new law was really about disclosure and attribution, right? So to me, it's like, I feel like we have to attribute and disclose who's doing what with AI, and then, and then make sure they're aligned. But I'd love to discuss it further. And if there's further reading that you think I should do, like that would be helpful, I could look into it. But I have to admit that I've sidestepped the whole line. Thanks.
Let's have one more question, and then we'll trade the coffee and cookies.
Okay, that's a question. Yeah. Yeah.
I think there might be questions on Zoom, and I'll defer to those if there are.
Oh, the Zoom question. Okay, let me see if I can find that.
We don't have anything entered at the moment.
Oh, it's just chat. Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I will raise my question. So, sort of like as a transhumanist idea or expansion of a humanist framework, at least in the law, there already are artificial persons in existence through corporations. So, on the idea of generative AI as a person or as some sort of artificial personhood, do you think there's any validity to an idea of that sort? And if there is, how would you place legal restrictions on it? Corporations, for example, don't have all the same rights as a person. Even after the Supreme Court recognized a right to marriage, they didn't recognize a right for corporations to be married. So how would you, if AI should be attributed some form of personhood, where do you think it would rank in a spectrum between true personhood all the way to corporations or maybe below corporations and some sort of even lesser person?
Right. Very, very interesting. By the way, now I'm worried that the next time the FTC tries to apply merger law, there'll be a corporate right to marry or corporate right to merge. Yes. So, there's that. I think it is such an interesting idea. I mean, I think that it's in terms of thinking about how to do this sort of thing. I think that there is I don't believe in the person, I think that I just did I did an essay a few years ago for an essay it was on corporate personhood, where I was highly critical of the idea. I felt like it was really, because to me, what the speech is ultimately about, a speech should be attributable to persons and persons should be responsible for their speech, right? And sort of like the problem with corporate personhood and corporate speech is that you have entities, like, you could have, for example, in the wake of the ACA, there were the insurers, or the insurers were saying we support it, and yet they paid $110 million to the Chamber of Commerce to oppose it. And there's nobody I can really point to say, you did a really bad thing there by, saying, and I think that to me is the same problem with generative AI, right? That the problem with generative AI is a problem of a lack of responsibility. And there's 10,000 engineers behind different sort of models. And when it does something really bad, like, for example, it recently defamed this professor, Jonathan Turley. It actually said, they asked ChatGPT, which professors have abused their students? They said, oh yeah, Jonathan Turley. It turns out he's controversial, but they took his controversy in general as leading to a thought that he might be the one most likely to have abused his students, right? Now, that's really terrible, right? And they need to be held responsible for that. But when it's a corporation, it's maybe going to be a fine on them. And then, how deterrent is that? Not really, especially if the shareholders are the one that ultimately are, maybe going to be hit by that. So I guess that's where I would come down on. I'm really worried about personhood, attribution of rights to these entities, that you can't point to an individual person who can bear some responsibility for punishment, who can. And your work, Professor Garvey's work on punishment as atonement comes to mind, because the idea is like a corporation can't atone in many ways, and the ChatGPT can't atone. It can't sort of have this sort of process of regret and reflection and self-remaking, I believe. So that's where I think I would come down on. Thanks.
So please join me thanking Professor Frank Pasquale again. And